The cranberry sauce slipped off the porcelain spoon and stained the white linen tablecloth like blood. Funny how things leave a mark when they're no longer wanted. It was Thursday evening. The room was warm with laughter. Brandon carving the roast Melissa. Scrolling through her phone, Noah hunched over his tablet. I sat quietly, not because I was full, but because I was empty. I wasn't hungry for food. I was starving for recognition. I had once believed that love meant giving without expecting anything in return. So I gave, and gave, and gave, for decades. But tonight something in the air had shifted. I cleared my throat gently. Today's a special day, I said with the best cheer I could fake. May 9th. Your father and I, Melissa, sighed, not bothering to look up. Oh God, here we go. Brandon didn't even raise his head. Mom, no one wants to hear that story again. You've told it 100 times. I was just going to say how he... For God's sake, can we have one meal without a history lecture? Brandon snapped. I froze. Napkin clenched in my lap. I looked over at Noah. For the first time all evening, he looked up from his tablet, smirked, and said it. Yes, shut up, widow. Like it was a joke. Like it meant nothing. Melissa chuckled under her breath. Brandon kept chewing. And in that moment, something broke inside me. Not with a dramatic crash, but the quiet fracture of glass in your hand before you realize you're bleeding. I sat there, cheeks burning, staring at the roast I once taught Brandon to. Seasoned when he was just 10 years old. The silence after Noah's words was louder than the insult itself. Have you ever been in a room full of people you once called family and suddenly realized you were a ghost? Tabitha, Melissa's sister, offered a weak smile. He didn't mean it that way, didn't he? I stood slowly. Thank you for dinner, I said. My voice was calm, but my knees trembled beneath me. Melissa didn't look up. But we haven't had dessert. I'm on a diet. No one offered to walk me out. No one hugged me goodbye. The porch light flickered as I stepped outside into the chilly air. I pulled my coat tightly around me and whispered to no one. I think that was my last Thursday dinner. And it was. When I got home, the house felt too quiet. Not peaceful. Just hollow. I took off my shoes and hung up my coat. The teapot whistled as if it had something important to say. I ignored it. I poured myself a cup of chamomile and sat at the kitchen window watching the empty street. My phone was silent. No message. No, did you get home safe? Nothing. Only then did I truly realize I didn't belong at their table anymore. I was 30 when my husband Robert passed away. Brandon was only 11, just a boy, and I was a young widow with an empty bank account and a heavy heart. The days that followed were quiet but demanding. Grief didn't have time to settle. There were bills, school lunches, and scraped knees to tend to. I clipped coupons, took a weekend job at the school library, skipped dinners to buy him textbooks. Someday you'll do great things, I whispered to him each night as I tucked him in. And when you do, just remember where you came from. Back then I believed that love was about sacrifice, and for a long time that belief carried me. When Brandon turned 21, I sold my inheritance, my father's farmland, outside Holleridge. That patch of soil, once meant to be my safety net, became his down payment for a starter home with Melissa, his girlfriend at the time. It's just dirt, I told him with a smile. You're my real future. I never told him how hard that decision was. I just wanted him to feel secure, to have the life I had struggled to build for him. When he married Melissa, I paid for most of the wedding. When Noah was born, I transformed my guest room into a nursery and offered to babysit every now and then. But now and then quickly became every day. I didn't mind, not really. At least not at first. I had dreams too, a trip to Alaska. Like Robert and I had once planned a rose garden in the backyard, maybe even a poetry class at the community college. But each time those dreams stirred, they were quietly pushed aside by someone else's needs. When Brandon lost his job, I paid their mortgage for 3 months without saying a word. When tutoring jobs were scarce, I drove him 3 nights a week across town for interviews. When Melissa was overwhelmed, I cooked for 5 and cleaned for 7. No one asked me to, but no one stopped me either. Not even when my knees ached from hours of standing. Not when I opened my fridge and saw more empty shelves than full ones. Not when I turned down offers from friends so I could watch Noah again. Someday, I kept telling myself, they'll see. They'll know what I gave. But that day never came. Instead, the list of things expected of me just kept growing. I wasn't seen as someone who built a life from scratch. I was simply there. Always present, always silent. And perhaps the saddest part, I didn't even know who I was outside of their needs. Unheard. It's strange how easily you forget your own dreams when they are constantly buried under someone else's needs. I had dreams once, small ones, gentle ones, a trip to Alaska with Robert, a rose garden in the backyard with white trellises and pink petals, a poetry class at the community college on Thursday nights. Little dreams, quiet dreams. But those dreams were always pushed aside. There was always something more urgent, someone who needed something more than I did. Brandon's job loss, Melissa's stress, Noah's school projects, grocery runs, errands, homework help. My life became a service. When Brandon couldn't pay the mortgage, I quietly transferred the money. When they didn't have a babysitter, I canceled my own plans. When Melissa said she was tired, I made dinner, did the dishes, and took Noah out for ice cream so she could rest. I didn't complain. Not when my hands ached from washing dishes. Not when my feet swelled from long errands. Not when my fridge was nearly empty. But theirs was full. I told myself, this is what mothers do. This is what love looks like. But I didn't realize how quietly I was disappearing. There is a kind of grief that doesn't come from losing someone else, but from losing yourself. I became invisible. To Brandon, I wasn't the woman who raised him through storms, who went without so he could have. I was just background, an extra, a side character in a life I helped create. He didn't see the woman who used to read him stories every night, who sat in the dark when we couldn't afford electricity, humming lullabies to ease his fears, who cried in secret so he wouldn't see her break. He saw a woman who talked too much about the past, who burned the potatoes who got in the way. And I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I hoped. Hope is a stubborn thing. I hoped one day he'd sit down and say, "Mom, I see you. I remember." But that day never came. Instead, Thursday dinners turned into polite obligation. Melissa stopped looking me in the eyes. Noah rolled his eyes every time I spoke. Brandon grew distant, his love buried under resentment I never understood. The woman I used to be, she was gone. And it happened slowly. So slowly I didn't notice. I gave up my voice, my identity, my rest, my body, piece by piece, day by day, until there was nothing left but a shell, smiling, serving, hoping. It was just a sentence, 4 words, spoken by a child who barely understood what they meant, but they landed like a slap across the soul. "Shut up, widow." Noah had said it with a smirk, like a joke, something he picked up from Melissa or worse, from Brandon. There was no hesitation, no regret, just a smug 12-year-old repeating what he heard without knowing what it cost. But Brandon didn't flinch. He didn't correct him. He didn't stop him. He just kept eating. That more than anything was what shattered me. I had been dismissed before, interrupted, ignored. I had swallowed sighs and rolled eyes like bitter medicine, thinking, maybe next time they'll listen. But this was different. This was mockery. Not just of my grief, but of my existence. I looked around the table, watching them carry on, as though I hadn't just been reduced to a punchline. Melissa giggled softly. Noah returned to his screen. Brandon carved his roast with quiet aggression, and I sat there, heat burning through my cheeks, a napkin trembling in my lap, unsure if I should cry or vanish. I remembered teaching Brandon how to season that roast. He was 10, standing on a stool beside me, beaming with pride as he sprinkled herbs like he was a chef on TV. Now he didn't even look at me. I felt the air change inside me. Something cracked. Not loud, but final. A quiet resignation blooming in my chest, like frost across a window pane. That's when I knew I no longer belonged here. I stood up not from anger, but from clarity. Thank you for dinner, I said calmly. Melissa, without lifting her eyes, replied, We haven't had dessert. I'm on a diet. I turned and walked away. No one followed. No one stopped me. And maybe that silence was louder than Noah's words. Outside, the wind cut through my coat like knives. The porch light flickered. I gripped my collar tight and whispered to no one. That was my last Thursday dinner. I meant it. That wasn't a moment of dramatic exit. It was something smaller, quieter, but more permanent. The kind of decision that grows in you slowly until one day it becomes undeniable. By the time I reached home, the sky had gone dark. My house was still, cold. Not physically, but emotionally. The kind of cold that seeps into the walls when no one calls, no one waits. I made myself tea. The chamomile tasted bitter. My phone didn't buzz. No texts. No missed calls. No one asking if I got home safe. It was in that silence that I realized I didn't just walk away from dinner. I'd walked away from a version of myself. And I didn't miss her. Not anymore. The house was still when I returned. Still and cold, not from lack of heat, but from the absence of care. For years, the silence had been my sanctuary. Now it felt like a sentence. I hung up my coat, slipped off my shoes, and made tea. The kettle's whistle was the only sound, sharp, shrill, like it was trying to wake me. I sat by the window, fingers wrapped around a mug of chamomile, looking out onto the empty street. No calls, no messages, not even a, "Did you get home safe?" That stung more than I expected. But maybe that's what I needed. The clean cut of truth. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out my old leather-bound day planner, once used for grocery lists and doctor appointments. Now it held something far more personal. The back section was labeled in my handwriting, Family Contributions. I had written it all down, not to keep score, not to demand repayment, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't imagining the weight I'd carried. I flipped through the pages. $28,000, Brandon's down payment for his first home. $10,000, their wedding expenses. $12,000, private school and tutors for Noah. $7,000, mortgage payments during Brandon's layoff. $5,000, Melissa's dental surgery. $3,000, car repairs, and then countless smaller entries, groceries, camp fees, holiday gifts, emergency babysitting. The total just over $70,000, all from my retired school librarian pension. I stared at the number, then ran my hand slowly across the ink. These weren't just figures. They were my sacrifices. Each line was a decision to give, to help to carry. And each decision had cost me something. My own dreams, my own rest, my own self. And yet when I spoke, I was told to be quiet. When I shared, I was dismissed. When I gave, I was forgotten. That planner wasn't just a record. It was a eulogy, a goodbye to the version of me who thought unconditional love meant endless sacrifice. When I closed the planner gently, my hands trembling slightly. I wasn't angry. Not yet, but I was waking up. Somewhere deep inside me, a quiet voice whispered, "You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to choose yourself." For so long, I thought choosing myself meant abandoning them. Now I saw abandoning myself was the real betrayal. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in the old armchair by the window, wrapped in the quilt my mother made decades ago. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, and the streetlights flickered like weary stars. The cup of tea in my hand had long since gone cold, but I kept holding it as if warmth could seep back in through memory alone. Brandon's silence, Noah's mocking, Melissa's indifference. Each of them had cut me deeper than I had let myself feel. But it wasn't the cruelty that haunted me. It was how easy it was for them. How natural it had become to ignore me, to dismiss me. I thought of the woman I once was. Strong, gentle, hopeful. And I asked myself, when did I become invisible? I stood slowly, my knees aching, and walked to the dresser in my bedroom. The top drawer creaked as I opened it, releasing the scent of cedar and paper. Under a stack of old sweaters was a mahogany box I hadn't touched in years. Inside it were letters, dozens of them, written in ink, folded neatly. My husband Robert's handwriting, from his work trips, from the early days of our marriage, from nights when we were apart, and all we had was paper and hope. I took one at random. The paper was soft with age, but his handwriting was still strong, slanted, full of character. Evelyn, I know you always doubt yourself, but you shouldn't. You are the glue that holds everything together. If they ever forget that, I hope you remember it for yourself. I pressed the letter to my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry. But they weren't bitter tears. They were warm, healing, because in those words Robert had seen me, not as a mother, not as a caretaker, but as Evelyn, a woman, a whole person. And I realized I had been waiting all these years for Brandon to say what Robert had already told me. That night I didn't sleep, but I also didn't despair. Instead, I crossed the room, opened the hallway closet, and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. The label read, "Quiet Nest Egg." It started as a few savings bonds, a small mutual fund, a couple of certificates. Just modest things I invested in through a senior finance club. Over 15 years it had grown to over $320,000. No one knew. Not Brandon, not Melissa. I also found a sealed envelope, Noah's college fund. Evelyn's name only. Inside $45,000, untouched. They thought I had nothing left, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. They thought I had nothing left. And for a long time I believed it too. I thought all I had to offer was my time, my hands, my history. But I was wrong. I had one last thing they didn't know about. And this time, I wasn't going to offer it. This time I would choose. By the end of the week, I had made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Jenna Holbrook, a local realtor I used to see every year at the town book fair. "Jenna," I said, my voice steady, "I want to sell my house." There was a pause. "You've lived there nearly your whole life," she said. "That's exactly why it's time," I replied. The second call was to the bank. I transferred all my investments into a new secure account, one Brandon could never access. The third was to a cab company. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. There was no need. I packed only what mattered. A few changes of clothes, my day planner, Robert's letters, family photo albums I couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything else Furniture decorations, even the wall clock Brandon once called too old-fashioned, I left behind without a second thought. When the taxi pulled up to the curb, I locked the door one final time, and I didn't look back. I expected sadness, but what I felt was air, a rush of space, like I could breathe again. I moved to Rose Bay, a small coastal town 2 hours away. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and it was mine. My new apartment sat atop a red brick building with white shutters and a tiny balcony that overlooked the bay. The breeze carried the scent of salt and baked bread from the bakery downstairs. I didn't tell anyone I had arrived. The first few days, I did nothing. No dishes to wash, no errands to run, no one to beg for attention from. I just existed, and that was enough. Chen Chen Chen. By the third day in Rose Bay, I walked into the local library. It smelled of old pages and lemon polish. Home. A young woman with curly hair and thick glasses looked up from behind the counter. Looking for anything in particular, she asked warmly. I smiled. Just a library card, I said. And maybe a quiet place to sit and read. Within a week, I was volunteering at the Saturday Children's Reading Hour. By the second month, they offered me a small stipend to help catalog new arrivals. It wasn't much, but it made me feel useful. Not in the way I had felt before, used drained, but in a way that lit me up from the inside. I started waking up earlier, brewed my own coffee strong with cream. I bought curtains in my favorite color. I planted 2 potted roses on the balcony, one red, one white. Every morning I watered them with care. Not for anyone else, but for me. There in that little town, I found small rituals that felt like worship. I spoke less, but when I did, people listened. I made a friend Leon, a retired literature professor who lived just down the hall. We talked about books, about music, about starting over. We didn't talk about family. He never asked, and I never offered. But one evening while we sat watching the bay turn silver under moonlight, he said, "You carry yourself like a woman who's finally decided she's worth her own time." I blinked, then smiled. Yes, that's exactly what I had become. I didn't send angry letters. I didn't make grand announcements. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Instead, I stitched myself back together quietly, softly, like mending a quilt with hands that had known too much pain. In Rose Bay, I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't someone's background. I was just Evelyn. And finally, that was enough. I was not. 2 months after I left, the letter came. It arrived in a white envelope, with my name written in Brandon's messy scrawl, like he had written it in a rush. Maybe he had. The first page was full of words too many, rambling apologies, vague acknowledgments, things like, "I guess we've been distant lately, and I didn't mean to upset you." But it was the second page that revealed the truth. "Noah's tuition is due. We're short. I know you said you're not supporting us anymore, but he's your grandson. He needs this." I stared at the paper, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not guilt, not obligation, just clarity. And I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer next to my reading glasses. I didn't write back, didn't call, didn't explain. Brandon could dress his need in 100 emotional costumes, call it family, call it love, call it duty, but I saw it for what it was. A habit. He had grown used to me being the safety net, the solution, the invisible lifeline, but I had cut the cord, and I had done it in silence. The house in Holleridge sold the following week. The funds cleared. Everything was clean, legal, irreversible. Brandon tried to challenge it in court, but the paperwork was flawless because I had handled every single detail myself. That day he called me 10 times. I didn't answer once. Combien? Instead, I walked to a small jewelry shop near the corner of Main Street in Rose Bay. Inside, I met Mr. Eberly, the owner. I placed a small gold band on the counter. My wedding ring, I said. I want it melted down, made into something simple, something strong. 1 week later, I returned. He handed me a slim, elegant gold bracelet. Inside it was engraved with 3 words. Words from one of Robert's letters, "You are enough." And for the first time in years, I believed it. One morning, I opened my mailbox. Inside was a postcard. It had a hand-drawn picture of a school on the front, crayon lines uneven but filled with care. On the back, just a few words written in shaky, familiar handwriting. "Grandma, I hope you're okay. I miss you. Noah." I stood on the porch for a long time just holding that card. No request, no manipulation, no guilt. Just a message. From a child to his grandmother. And I smiled. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the loudest, clearest truth. I never screamed. I never slammed doors. I never demanded repayment, but I walked away. Not to punish them, but to protect what was left of me. You see, when you give everything, your time, your money, your voice, some people forget you're a person. They start to see you only as the help, the background, the reliable shadow, until one day you vanish, and they finally notice the space you used to fill. I never went back, but I never closed the door either, because I didn't need revenge. I needed peace, and in Rose Bay, I found it. So to anyone watching, anyone who has poured themselves into others until there's nothing left, let me tell you this. You are not selfish for choosing yourself. You are not cruel for walking away. You are not wrong for saying no more. You are enough. You always have been. If you're still watching this, maybe you've seen yourself somewhere in Evelyn's story. Maybe you've sat at a dinner table, surrounded by people you love, and still felt utterly invisible. Maybe you've told yourself, it's okay. They just don't understand. Yet. Maybe you've whispered, someday they'll see what I gave. Someday they'll thank me. Someday I'll matter. But what if that someday never comes? Evelyn spent decades giving her time, her money, her energy, her dreams. She gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. But here's the truth. Giving without boundaries is not love. It's slow erasure. When you constantly place others before yourself, you're not being kind, you're being forgotten. And when the people around you grow used to your sacrifice, they stop seeing it. They stop seeing you. Evelyn's story is not just about walking away. It's about walking back to herself. She didn't slam doors. She didn't scream. She simply stood up and said silently but powerfully, enough. And in that choice, she didn't lose anything. She gained everything. Peace, dignity, selfhood. So if you're watching this and wondering, how much more can I give? Here's your answer. You've already given enough. Now it's time to receive, to breathe, to rebuild. You don't need to earn your worth. You were born with it. Say it with me, now I am enough. not because of what I give, but because of who I am.